My name is Sarah Rooker, and I'm the director for the Norwich Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome you all to First Wednesdays for December. As many of you know, First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council, and is co-hosted by the Norwich Historical Society and the Norwich Public Library. First Wednesdays is supported statewide by the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Foundation. The Norwich Bookstore is underwriting tonight's event. The Historical Society and the library would like to thank our generous sponsors for the entire series: the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledyard National Bank, Mascoma Savings Bank, and Norwich Historical Society. I would ask you at this time to turn off your mobile devices if you haven't already. And I'm going to invite Penny McConnell from the Norwich Bookstore to the podium to introduce our speaker tonight. So thank you for coming.
I have to turn off my mobile device. Good evening, everyone. I come to this evening wearing 3 hats. I'm an expired member. Is that what I am? No. I'm a past member of the Vermont Humanities Council, and I'm a present member of the board of the Norwich Public Library, and I'm the Norwich Bookstore, which is underwriting tonight's evening. Born and bred, New Hampshire, sorry. Local girl makes good. Virginia Heffernan is a journalist, critic, and author, most recently of Magic and Lost, The Internet as Art, which we will be hearing about tonight. From 2012 to 2014, Virginia was the national correspondent at Yahoo News. From 2008 to 2012, she wrote The Medium, a weekly column about internet culture for the New York Times Magazine. Before that, she spent 4 years as a television critic at the New York Times. In 2002, Virginia received a PhD in English and American literature from Harvard. She's written for The New Yorker, Mother Jones, New York Magazine, Salon, The Wall Street Journal, and many, many other publications. She's appeared on The Open Mind, 2020, CNBC, MSNBC, and regularly on our wonderful New Hampshire Public Radio, Vermont Public Radio, and National Public Radio. As an academic and a journalist, she has lectured at Google, the Library of Congress, the National Gallery of the Arts, the New York Public Library, and at many universities and corporations. Her essays have been widely anthologized. Kevin Kelly, the co-founder of Wired, writes, quote, "Heffernan is a new species of wizard. It is a joy and a revelation to be under her spell." Ben Yagoda named Virginia in the Chronicle of Higher Education among his top candidates for the best. Is that me that's making that happen? I know why. Paper was on top of the thing. Sorry about that. He named Virginia in the Chronicle of Higher Education among his top candidates for the best living writer of English prose. And she's also been called one of the mothers of the internet. Please welcome Virginia Heffernan to Norwich.
Turn it off. You did. Okay. Hi. That Mothers of the Internet thing came from, hold on one second. Came from, how's that, the sound? Came from a millennial, and I just was like, wait a second. ARPANET is 1950. You know, I don't want to, I'm not sure I'm a mother of the Internet, but he was 25. Of course, I'm much more nervous speaking here than I would ever be at the Library of Congress or Google, because it's the hometown crowd, and you guys should give me a hard time. I have former teacher here, so I really feel like an imposter. Here goes. I was born here. I consider Hanover and Norwich, the upper Connecticut River Valley, the birthplace of both me and online me, internet me. Not a lot of people associate northern New England with the internet, but I, in the book, try to stake a claim that Dartmouth and especially the Kiewit Computing Center in Hanover, really played a major part in the history, especially of network computing. When John Kemeny came here, he'd been Einstein's assistant at the Advanced Institute of Studies at Princeton, and he had already written BASIC, which, a computer language that was the first to make programming legible and possible for people trained in the humanities and without extensive training like the kind he had in mathematics and computer science. And so, in all the discussions of making computing personal and bringing it home, we think of Steve Jobs and we think of Bill Gates, but Kemeny created a natural computing language, natural language computing, and that was very important. So anyway, he came here, he was in the math department, he rose to be the president, and by the time he had, he had the authority and the trust of the college, he proposed that that Hanover give up some precious Dartmouth colonial real estate to install a gigantic mainframe computer. I'm forgetting the name of the model exactly that the first one was, but those heaving rhinoceroses that breathe and shake and rattle behind bulletproof glass that now have nothing like the processing power of even the simplest phone, but they seemed like they could move mountains in those days. Installed it at Kiewit in the middle of town, but partly he had to make some agreement with the Hanover Improvement Society and the good people of Hanover that if they let this monstrosity in town, that he would give something back to the town. And he was really an extraordinary person, and one of the things he agreed to do, and I have the details a little, remember this is memoir, so I've checked it out with Kemeny's kids and other kind of Kemeny chronicles, but it may not be exactly as I remember, but in any case, as I understand it, as I remember it, in 78 or 79, he agreed that in exchange for putting in this mainframe computer, he would help teach the school children BASIC. And at Silsby Hall, I got to, at 8 or 9, go to a presentation by John Kemeny himself on programming. The pitch he made to the parents and teachers was that if we got this talk, we would get, 10 years after the moon landing, a shot at the holy grail of existence, which was to work for NASA. So I somehow went to this thing thinking, I'm taking some time out of school to go do this thing. I don't know what it is. I think it's like going to be a mathematics lesson in the multiplication tables. I have no idea what it would be. And that somehow, from this math lesson, I would land on the moon later in my life. And so anyway, we dutifully went off. And like all these things in the 70s and 80s, almost everybody filed out completely indifferent at the end of the lecture, except for 4 boys and me, who moved down to the front of the row and couldn't get enough of it. We'd seen our first computer program, a very simple program. Kemeny cleverly knew that we would want to tell our siblings that they were idiots, and so the program mostly let you enter in your brother's name and say X is an idiot, in my case Andrew's an idiot. And I thought it was the height of humor, and I couldn't believe that I could make this looped thing. And I also just, everything about it appealed to me. I have a friend who grew up in South Carolina, always felt like sort of an odd duck, and then the first time, she was always drawn to Japanese culture. The first time she went to Japan, she saw a bento box and said, "This is the way I've always thought food should be served, and I never want to leave," and she didn't. And I felt the same way. I just was like, I don't really know what this is, but I like the crossed zeros, which I'd never seen before. I like the dot matrix printer. I like the frilly sides of it. I like programming on paper, that was the demo. It was on paper, not on a screen. I like the people. I like Kemeny. I like even the other boys that moved into the front row. And just, I'll have this. Whatever this is, I want this. So some of us followed, and not that day, but later, found ourselves at Kiewit, the computing center that also eventually sold hardware. We went into this place, some of the kids, and instantly got to know these sysprogs, system programmers. And the sysprogs, where my classmates, heard the name Jim Morrison or something and thought, or lead singer, and thought this was like swoony Beatles material, screaming for Elvis. I thought that about the Sis Frogs. I just was like, what do they know? What can they, because they're shaggy, they're hippies, they're way cooler. I mean, maybe this was just my taste, but I just thought those early hackers were like about as cool as you got. And they got me on, they quickly introduced me, I think partly just to get me out of their hair, they quickly introduced me to this Conference XYZ, this networked program that was sort of almost like a social network, but with game elements. So it was a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons. You'd take a name, you'd play a role on it, you'd have certain very not real world status, that I could tell you all about it, but you were ranked, and you could do certain game-like things to each other, like kill each other and knock each other off the network, or menace each other in certain silly ways. Like we, instead of trolling, which people do online now, we scrolled each other. To scroll someone was to send them just like a random set of like ampersands that would suddenly just like fill their screen. And then at the bottom you'd say, you've been scrolled. And you were 10. That was pretty funny, And it was also pretty funny to get to do that to someone that was 25 or 30, It was like just the same way hackers and imps and trolls, and from all the way from the totally harmless ones up to the like 4chan nightmare crowd think. Just like, how can I disrupt things a little bit? How can I show my skills and be a little mess and get into adults' lives? So for me, I took the road more foolishly traveled and decided that I would make my life on Conference XYZ rather than become a better programmer. So the 4 boys, to their credit, became better programmers. One of them went to work ultimately for DreamWorks making games, but not me. I decided to just stay and socialize and play this Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game, and basically have spent the rest of my life trying to justify that terrible decision. And that's what this book's about, so thank you. I got online and we started doing things like people do online now. And those things include creating names, making avatars for ourselves. Very like kids now, my first avatar, so my first online self-presentation was a name meant to convey more strength than I had, more status than I had, more power, more aggression, and it was Athena. My son, who's 11, who, not too much older than I was when I created my first avatar, just took his first self-portrait, or what's it called, bio photo for Google. So, all of Google, like you can have a little picture of yourself. And I saw the one he put up. And, he's like a round-faced, freckle-faced kid, and his picture is him in CEO pose, kicked back, like, I got this world by, I got this world. So I said, why'd you choose this one? It's not like a cute picture of you. And he said, no, right, exactly. I mean, I chose this from like 200 other options, where he looks smiley and sweet in like a school photo. Why'd you choose this? And he said, don't I look strong and powerful? I don't know where he got the meme that corner office, jerks sit like that, but it sunk in. And so that's his Athena. It's armor. It's wise warrior. It's bigger than he is. Later, I expect that his avatar, his fear will not be that he'll be attacked and embarrassed online. His fear will be that he doesn't connect with anyone online. And that's when he may have the teenage avatars that are like shy girl, sad gay boy, like that kind of stuff. When parents actually start worrying about their children online, are in the time when they're most likely to make those connections. But as you can see, my interest became the interest in digital culture, and digital culture from the beginning. So like just while the code, and it's hard to convey how early this was in networked computing. I mean, no one, it takes a while for people to believe that I joined the internet in 1979. I will say, I didn't hear the word internet until the web. So I didn't hear the word internet till 13 years later. This is not, when I got a personal computer later, so when I got a Macintosh later, it was like a step back. It was like, what? This doesn't do anything. It's just like this, it doesn't it's inert. It doesn't like have any spiritual connections to the world. Where this, this other thing that I had before, which would seem to the personal computing side, to the Microsofts and the Apples, to have been a much less interesting device. But the device I used to connect to Kamini's powerful mainframe was kind of like a Chromebook now. They used to literally call it a dumb terminal because it knew nothing in its little head. It just was this empty device until you dialed in with a modem to the mainframe, in which case all the brains in the world and all these people flooded into your house. I will say we had one phone line. We still only do one landline. My parents have cell phones now, but I got my 10,000 hours, as they say. In other words, I became a full-blown addict and was on the computer all the time, tying up the phone line dawn to dusk. And when my parents needed to get one important phone call through and stop me from playing Athena with my little online friends, I was furious because they would pick up the phone and boop, you've been disconnected, and I would be like, it's just like nothing could be worse. And I still am I'm sorry. And I'm sorry to all your friends that were trying to get through to got a busy signal day and night. Anyway, so I played this game. I got interested in digital culture, but I also developed, and I guess this is sort of the focus, what I mean to focus on today more than I usually do. I think, like a lot of people, I'm feeling sort of solemn since the election, those early days on the computer, and I'm trying to be bolder and bolder about saying this, but were very much a religious experience. So looking at, and for me, some people get this looking at the night sky or after a cancer diagnosis, but for me, looking in that dark background, that old screen, the green phosphor letters in the front, first just caps and then we could do mixed cases, was like, I just looked at it for so long trying to fathom what was back there. And I was a teenager, so I was becoming a teenager, so I was like flaring with curiosities and physical changes, and somehow the pressure between who's back there, where are all these voices that talk to me coming from, voices that were increasingly saying like, I love you, I want to meet you, like all the things people say to each other online now, or we're making jokes, or we're indulging my desire to talk about Reaganomics or whatever, or like speak in French. I wish Madame Anderson were here because my middle school, everything I learned that would make me look sophisticated, I tested out on Conference XYZ. A great place to make social mistakes, by the way, because if you really fall apart, you can always change your name. So the play of those symbols in the front and that like deep dark background, which was like, what is it? I know it's some combination of engineering, but it's engineering that lots of this is wireless, and all I could do was put God in that place. And much later, when I renounced computers and decided that they were like unfeminine and uncool and only geeks used them, and I did that very not geeky thing, which was a PhD in English, which of course made men come running. But when I decided to do a PhD in English, I ended up reading Erich Auerbach's great book about the way literature represents reality called Mimesis. And in that book, one of the things he does is talk about, I'm going to put this very schematically, but he talks about the difference between two kinds of prose styles, basically. The prose style that he identifies with the Old Testament, with the Torah, which he calls, I always mix this up, paratactic, versus the hypotactic style of certain other writers. He says Boccaccio, Chaucer. But just to get a sense of that difference, again, put very simplistically, Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, is definitely in the first category. God said, let there be light, and there was light is in the first category. Very, usually short sentences with so-called weak connectives between them, and no subordinate clauses. So it's just like, Hemingway writes this way sometimes, they tasted the bread and it was good. And then the alternative are these longer sentences. I've tried to rewrite Veni Vidi Vici with hypotactic clauses, and well aware of the possibilities of the confrontation with the city he was about to sack, and extremely mindful of his own grandiosity, like that kind of thing. But you can sort of see, and I should find where I wrote that. It's hilarious, I'm sure. Slightly arcane waste of time. But so those two kinds of sentences, and it tends to be, the second one is meant to sort of seal out the reader in certain ways, because you're being told which thing is important and which thing comes next and why something happened, and you're led very, in a almost childlike way from one thing to the next. Not a lot of trust is invested in you by language like that, and you feel slightly maybe controlled or entertained or in awe, where the opposite is the style of the Elohist, which is like what Auerbach called the writer of the Torah, is able to conjure with these short sentences that demand that you go closer, you go more than halfway to meet the text. You start supplying unconsciously what connects one sentence to the next, what connects one declaration to the next. You see the face of God. Because you start to be like, nothing could motivate actions this powerful except for something God, except a mystery that I can't name. And that, in the loose connectives of this computer screen, is what I started to do. And I started to think language, which is so potent to me, is so powerful to me in the front, had this like crazy depth model of outer space behind it that I started to situate in whatever the internet was. I called it in those days just the computer. But the fact that I could go to this small desk and just be a kid in New Hampshire and just have suddenly all the world open before me made me, it was transformative and enacted some kind of conversion on me. I almost never read from this last chapter, but it was the hardest one to write, and the rest of the book is kind of quite authoritative and journalistic and claims a lot of mastery for myself. The last chapter, I'm a nutcase. So here's the nutcase chapter. A failed atheist. In 2014, I'd been living with the internet, one form or another, for 35 years. From my preteen adventures on Conference XYZ to my work reviewing mobile apps like Square Cache and Device 6 for Yahoo News. These ethereal leanings, literally toward the ether, of tech developers, evangelists, critics, engineers, executives, and hackers were familiar to me. I saw them to myself. Electronic circuitry, as Marshall McLuhan called it, was doing something to my nervous system, something not quite empirical and not quite measurable. I had studied McLuhan's stunty musings since college. I knew him to be a Roman Catholic mystic whose far-out ideas of the media as the extensions of man derived from the anthropology of the beaver trade in remotest Canada. How did such far-flung, lonesome, and polyglot traders build a market, a shared space with transmissible values, if not through the air, through the ether, through strange systems of semiotics that seductively eluded explanation? Many other writers on media came to the subject through the study of the drumbeats of East Africa. Some came through the study of church bells and prayer calls and how they communicate across vast distances. How are time and space compressed through sound, semaphore, and symbol? I will say that McLuhan did grow out of this writing, McLuhan's work grew out of this writing about the beaver trade, and also a lot of the other sort of media theorists came from remote locations. And this is particularly interesting to me in trying to write about Hanover and Vermont and this little valley as a cradle of a certain kind of way of thinking about sort of the human internet. Because ARPANET is all that existed on the West Coast. At the same time, the internet with Athena, with all this playfulness and poetry was growing up here. And what in the world, one of the first things that Kamini wanted to do here is collaborate with Edward Latham, who used to run the Rare Books department, who I don't know if any of you knew him, but I mean, he's the farthest thing from a techie. He was like, I don't know, like pocket square wearing kind of fop who loved his rare books, right? And very, I don't know, tell me more, pipe smoking, I don't know. I imagine him in certain ways. But Kamini's first idea was to come here and collaborate with him, not with IBM, not with, entrepreneurs. It wasn't about entrepreneurial spirit. It was about how he could, one of his very first projects was to enter and classify the works of Robert Frost online. This is a Hungarian with no background in, American poetry, much less regional New Hampshire poetry, and not too long after, Kennedy's inaugural poem, just invests himself so much in the American grain and here, in just like our cold climate, to do this thing and build the culture of the internet. And why? Why is this such a good place for it? Well, partly because there are kids like me, just like there was a kid like Marshall McLuhan, sitting at your desk thinking like, I am snowed in and I don't know where my life is gonna go. And all of a sudden, just the same way that like astronomers are born in remote places, there's like less light pollution and you can like see the stars. I felt like with fewer distractions, I could like really look at this thing and invest myself in how in heck is all this stuff coming into my house, And I didn't have the opportunity. I liked the numbers too. Not everyone likes this, and people who don't like the internet hate the numbers, hate that like Twitter and Facebook are, filled now, in Facebook's case, with billions of people. But I loved it. I couldn't get enough of the fact that like there are 40 people online right now. I should just parenthetically say, I really, really did deeply, deeply believe that I knew every single person by name, habit, and everything online at one time in history. That was how big this whole thing seemed to me. So I just felt like I lived in this other world. The other thing that it does for kids and people growing up in remote places, digital technology, is allow them to form identities outside their immediate surroundings. So what I learned later about Conference XYZ was that it was in large part a cruising site for gay men. I wrote about it in the Times, and a bunch of men wrote in and said, well, what we were doing there is that we are like denied social space in which to be gay at Dartmouth. And so we get to take names and meet each other in this other way, which was more or less how I was using it. I was just like a know-it-all kid who wanted to talk about subjects I had no place talking about, like Reaganomics. And, I was like, I'm not getting a hearing outside at the dinner table, understandably. But look at this. These people fall silent when I send them my well-reasoned arguments about trickle-down. Okay, so something else drew me to media studies, the dynamics of proselytizing and propaganda and the selling of ideas. And I'm really reading this from Martha Ozersky, who's here. Proselytizing by the left, by the right, by professors of political science, meteorology, women's studies. Propaganda by Goebbels, by the Vatican. I'm going to change this a little bit. By Richard Spencer and the alt-right, by feminists, by Wyden and Kennedy. In the 80s and 90s, you'd have to have cut every single high school and college class not to have been influenced by post-war teachers and their obsession, shaded by a determination not to let the Holocaust happen again, with how minds get made up. My teachers of various political stripes and various disciplines perseverated on tyranny, authority, mind control, brainwashing, advertising, and duty. So I did too. So how do we make up our minds? Long after my formal studies, I found the answer in an unlikely place, a documentary called The Tail Enders. There's a long summary of this beautiful, extraordinary movie documentary, I won't go into that too much, but I want to tell you what I learned from it. The Tail Enders' focus is something called the Global Recordings Network, which was founded in 1939 in Los Angeles by an evangelical named Joy Ritterhoff. She wanted to disseminate Bible stories, and particularly the Damascus Road conversion story, in order to make converts in far-flung places. And she went through the usual languages, every language you can name, the language you kind of know about, the hybrid languages, dialects of those languages, from 39 all the way to now. She's long since died, but that she, finally got into languages only spoken languages, with maybe only 7 people who speak them. And just the Global Recording Network desire to be completist was determined to translate into these languages that nobody has learned, and they're like shaker, they're about to die out. So they put the Damascus Road story into these languages that no linguist had learned, no one had studied, and with only that tenacity of missionary. You know, it's just like, there's so many things so many things that wouldn't have been learned except for evil colonialism and missionaries. But in any case, so they went to these places, but of course, oral languages, they couldn't drop them in on paper. So they started to put them on tape, but then no one had electricity, so they couldn't play the tapes. So then they ended up inventing, and this is so much how technology proceeds, driven by this desire to spread the word, spread the gospel, they created hand crank audio machines that were really good. And you could drop them in, she says, and actually shows pictures of like basically a jungle atmosphere where like a particular pygmy dialect is spoken by 20 people. And it fell in, and the conversion rate, and now they use the word conversion rate in Silicon Valley to talk about how many people visit J.Crew and then actually buy from J.Crew. But it really is, like you're just like, what's your conversion rate? But anyway, their conversion rate was enormously high, like 100%. If you heard the story in your language on this thing when you played the hand crank, you were done. You were just like, sign me up, I'm this. So, but instead of that being a reaction to the content, instead of that being just like an amazing, I'm blown away by the story of this Damascus Road conversion, what the hypothesis of this documentary is that what they were being moved by was disembodied sound, by the simple fact of sound coming from a place you don't expect it to come from. And that once the burning bush, once Moses has spoken to her, once a voice comes to you from a quarter you don't expect it to and you don't see someone speaking, you'll believe whatever. You'll believe whatever. And Steve Jobs' later commitment to making sound come from a place this big, the iPod, was in part to enact that very conversion. Like, you see the iPod, you hear the music that you love so much, that's so moving from it, and it doesn't matter what else you hear, you're putty in your putty, you enact a conversion of the secular kind. And we all became Apple acolytes. So I also found that something in this digital technology, so like a screen that you could set up that then talked to you in my own language, in natural language, that was moving, that's used words like love, and later with Facebook, all the kindergarten words that are like share and friend, that are just go straight to our limbic system, straight to our like comfort, but come from this strange quarter with no mouth around it. It's A, uncanny, but B, quite persuasive, quite persuasive, because you sort of know how to handle a human talking to you and evaluate his motivations, but when a machine talks to you, you're thrown off. And as Joey Ito, the head of the Media Lab, says, that can be for good or ill, right? I mean, this book never makes a moral argument about technology. And I will say, Joey Ito, and this is where I'm going to move into another new topic, which is Donald Trump. Joey Ito is very brilliant, and he makes the case that Donald Trump is an incredibly progressive candidate who uses and understands all this technology and all this decentralized systems and anti-hierarchical, flat, everything that we've been preached at is good and is the future. That he's the candidate, he's the real tech candidate and president, and we don't want to hear that, because we want to hear that the internet is moving in sync with liberal democracy. And what he says is, we never said this would be good. We never said this would be good. I mean, I hate saying that, but and the book is called Magic and Lost, with a bias toward magic, because I fell in love with the internet at an early age, and I'm invested in the art it produces. I think Twitter is a form of poetry. I don't mean that it's good or bad poetry. It's certainly doggerel a lot of the time, but it's incredibly effective, highly artificial use of language, and that's poetry to me. And I think Instagram is a form of art too. That self-portraiture there is not unlike frescoes, that it uses palettes we're familiar with. I don't think any of these things are neurotoxins, but nor do I think that they're going to particularly save us. So the disembodied sound. If you, like me, like to draw out moments of wonder over such matters like disembodied sound, marveling at the mysteries of consciousness, shared and separate, and the unlikeliness of death's finality. This also follows a discussion of the cloud, where we save all our stuff. The cloud is a coinage, and it's usually capitalized. The cloud is a coinage of a bunch of evangelical Christians in Houston who are quite invested in salvation and sit on the board of these evangelical megachurches. And the idea that consciousness, that the things we make survives the death of the hardware, that your computer can fall apart and everything you have is saved in the cloud, is a quite eschatological, cosmological, fact of our existence, strange fact of our existence. So perhaps one day you read about Ray Kurzweil's demented confidence in the singularity and his further demented confidence that death might be cheated. I'll say that 3 years ago, and he's only gotten stranger, Kurzweil told a reporter that he thought his prospects for eternal life, I have a good chance, I put it at 80%, of going to the point where my life becomes indefinite, because you may be adding more time than's going to be in your remaining life expectancy. I mean, this is an actual thinking, breathing person who's on the payroll at Google, and he's pretty sure that everyone your age, if you take the right supplements, will never die. This isn't like some guy ranting on the street. Maybe you were drawn to the sci-fi trickster Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey and posited 3 laws of something, culminating in any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I was captivated by that idea. At the same time, my own religious life had taken some unlikely turns. The daughter of a Methodist cum Episcopalian mother, a Roman Catholic father, authorized to take communion at the Anglican Church. I was going to say something about how I never really understood your special dispensation, but anyway, that's for another time. I was baptized at the age of 7 as an Episcopalian. In preparation for my confirmation, I served as an altar girl at the St. Thomas, the rector's here tonight, and took theology classes with our priest. In my junior year in high school, I started to seek intoxication and romance at Dartmouth College. I got decent grades, acted out some. I'm sort of skipping over some of this. So for my physics project in my senior year, I decided to figure out how television worked. I wanted once and for all to sort of take apart my love of technology and reduce it to its component parts and rub the religion away from it. And I never understood it. I just may not have the brain for it, but I worked so hard to understand tube television, and my whole final presentation was just I don't really get it. So anyway, take this with a grain of salt, except that at the same time, those old tube television lipsticky reds and the kiddie pool blues of analog TV sets continued to stir and move me. So I got to the University of Virginia. Christianity turned both frightening and boring. Too few Roman Catholics to keep things rigorous. No Jesuits or Jews, who I came to believe held the keys to actual mental pleasures. For the first time, I heard people identify as non-sectarian Christians, like the compact George W. Bush style. At length, I came to understand this meant Baptists. My first-year roommate was an extremely gifted triple varsity athlete in volleyball, basketball, and softball. They had overlapping seasons. She was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Do people know about that? Anyway, she had a poster on her wall about how you should score goals for God. But as an intellectually restless northerner, both depressed and envious of the minds around me, I realized the most sensible move for me would be to embrace atheism. Remember, I still think televisions are inhabited by angels, so I don't know what chance I had for actually swearing off God. I mean, I was way in the tank for, the weirdest stuff. But anyway, I'd sworn off computers, which I loved, so I thought I could swear off God. And by the way, it was the same motivation. I just was it's uncool to like computers, it's uncool to like God. These things are turning me into a nerd. And so, I'm going to have to just gun it through this new thing and whatever. So I bought a cumbersome Apple IIe to college for word processing, and the Apple IIe, because it wasn't networked, wasn't as captivating as the computer I grew up with, so I So I didn't have the same kind of enchantment with it. Atheism didn't take. I studied philosophy, and in seminars with names like Shakespeare and Evil and Faith and Doubt, I listened to these rangy, punky guys talk about God's non-existence. Their arguments produced in me a metallic, God's non-existence, did I say that? A metallic, sad feeling. Brad Braxton, an unforgettable Eagle Scout, black, who wanted to be a preacher, was also in Faith and Doubt. He ended up getting at Rhodes and studying at Oxford, and it now runs the Religion in the Public Sphere program at the Ford Foundation. But instead of making comments in the seminar, he preached in the king mode. He was practicing, and we just fell silent. And there was this devout sweetheart, also Christian, named Anne, and she was sort of his witness. There was like a vandal in the class who was an atheist. He would sometimes come into class twice. He came in with having busted his hand open because he smashed a mirror or a window and broke his hand, thinking about what idiots we all were for believing in God. So I just was confused, because I really didn't think that at this point we were talking about God's existence or non-existence in scientific terms. It sounded like these were 7 different performance pieces, and I was still trying to cast myself in a role. Also, I missed computers. So I went into the philosophy department half thinking I'd get to do artificial intelligence. That wasn't the thing to do. So like a lot of people, I got my education around the curriculum, and I met a guy named Peter Cousins, who had also grown up with a computer. He'd gotten a Commodore 64 and gotten a real programming job at 13 at MCI, thwarting private calls by employees. And we would walk around like we were confessing our pre-web fascination with digital technology, as if we were both we're anorexic. We were just nobody can hear us, and I would not want to be seen with him, and he wouldn't want to be seen with me, because someone might find out that we were into computers. But he introduced me to a bunch of books. Anyway, not until my senior year, finally, a computer in 1991, and just, digitization has moved at such a breakneck pace that it is just hard to remember. In 1991, no networked computers in the whole school, no email, no anything. And yet, in 79, I had been on a networked, a huge network system. So it was just this weird way that history moved. Class was formal logic, and it was required for my philosophy major. It had green backlit symbols. It did not have, I forgot to say, I hated the Apple interface. And this is true for a lot of people that grew up with another interface. I love how vigorously 2 people are nodding right now. You're just yes. The smiley face, I just was I'm done. And when I think about that dark, revelatory screen, I think of it as this. I had this European friend who was had infinite variety to her and grooves in her face. And the next time Steve Jobs came in, it was she'd been to the plastic surgeon and gotten her nose bobbed, and gotten some special personality training, and now was hello. And I just spent all my time trying to bait her back into some depth, and was just what happened to you? And I also, the darkness was missing in the bitmap, the PixMap. It was just, you couldn't see the sky. You couldn't even imagine, your brain was shut down. It was it was hypotaxis at their worst, just condescending, seal you out, you don't have any brain for yourself. And I still, and I only later discovered lots of people felt heartbroken at that moment and severed from this really powerful relationship you'd had that empowered you to think you could talk to the machine, Anyway, I got it a little bit back with this formal logic program. I used to spend sometimes all night in this computer lab using these ancient principles of modus ponens and modus tollens. I don't know if anyone did formal logic, but P's and Q's, and to see this formality of it on these screens, and the dark yonder of the screen back again. And suddenly I just was I can't hold this back any longer. This is where I always want to live. I just want to, I'm not going to say it's geeky. It's all right, I'll go to hell if I'm just going to be a geek forever. This is where I belong. And Yeah, so as a would-be philosopher, I came to sort of believe, and this was an effect of this area, or Dartmouth, in the 80s. There were a fair number of Eastern Europeans who came to our dinner table, and they were typically Jewish, and their stories sometimes sounded like this. So Steve Scher, one of my favorite, was a Hungarian musicologist here, and his story, when he told it in a compressed way, was something like, I was outside Budapest, I was afraid for the Nazis, I changed my name to Hungarian name, or my parents did, and then I ran out of the forest and went to Yale and became a musicologist. It was just like, I never understood how they suddenly had PhDs, like a week after, anyway. So I just was like, he has like this truthful experience and collision with history. He has the heroism of having left and gotten out, and he has the brilliance of this like very playful imagination. And I just like wanted some of that. So these Jewish philosophers were really enchanting to me, and ultimately I converted to Judaism to get married, and just to make things as hard on myself as possible, I got divorced and converted back. But that's a story for another time. Essentially, through all this, strange as it may sound, my spiritual life has always been grounded in the internet. And there's just something in that idea of this like throbbing collective consciousness and now this many people. It's like a human brain, mine anyway, cannot manage the fact that nearly the population of the earth rivals the number of cell phone subscriptions there are, or 4 billion people are regularly online. It's just, I don't even know what that looks like, except that we are whipping up something very fascinating and crazy and unpredictable and moving and terrifying that is this online civilization. And if Donald Trump is a byproduct of it or a masterful user of it, then that's the civilization we live in. But we owe it to ourselves to not tell ourselves that this is nothing but a distraction, a neurotoxin, cat videos, but that this is the biggest entry. I say in the book, and people used to laugh at this, that as an idea, it rivals monotheism itself. And it's been amazing to me that in the 20 years since I've written about 23 years or something since the web, that I've talked about this stuff, it used to be like, honestly, people would cite it as Virginia's crazy, that I thought it was an idea that rivaled monotheism. And the other day, I saw someone put on Twitter, well, I just have always agreed with Virginia that as an idea, the internet rivals monotheism. I was just like, I can't believe it. Complete adaptation, and like without even, but even if you don't want to go that far, and I guess I'll just end with a little bit of a call to action. The internet does represent this possibility for creativity, for better online citizenship, for shrewder gameplay, just simply learning the ins and outs of how Twitter works. Even if you only decide that you're going to set your security, you're never going to look at it again. But certainly not fear for it. And, the internet proficiency is nothing like a function of age. There are some of the earliest adapters of the internet, of Web 2.0, the video and so forth, were people schooled in radar and sonar who, in the Second War, whose whole lives, on some level, they said, like the way that woman was waiting for the bento box, or I was waiting for for a simple basic program. They were waiting for another opportunity to communicate through the ether. There's this guy, Geriatric 1929, he's a pensioner in England, who was one of the first people on YouTube. It was like he was retired, his wife had died, he said he had no purpose, and then he saw YouTube, and it was like all the strength that he had experienced in the British Navy came back. His brain exploded. He knew how to do it. You can still find videos on there, and he's known as an OG of YouTube. I don't know if people know what that means. OG means original gangsta. It's like the first people, to make usually rap music. But anyway, so he's like this old British man, and they're just like, OG, it's funny. So in any case, there's no reason not to bring your best resources, your best game, even to the decision to shut the internet out of your life, because that's a decision, but make it deliberately and intentionally. And there are wonderful ways to even go to the dark internet if it scares you. Or, one possibility that people have proposed for the scourge of trolls and alt-right on Twitter is, what if we just turned Twitter into like a wasteland for brown shirts and everybody went somewhere else? Like, what if we never quoted Donald Trump's tweets ever? It was just like, he's just yelling into, some place that doesn't matter. So that's an option. Or embrace it, even just with your, emotional imagination. Instagram is not a neurotoxin. Instagram is photography. There's like a tradition of thinking about two-dimensional representations of objects in color. And it's been amazing to see people sort of find themselves in this new civilization, but we also have a real responsibility to this new civilization, and to navigate what I call the magic and the loss. So thank you. And we want to do, oh my God, I went so over. We want to do some questions. So fire away.
The big monster in Hewitt, was that, did you feed it punch cards?
I didn't touch. Oh, did he, with the monstrous mainframe computer at Kiewit, did it work on punch cards? I think the first iteration did, but I never was allowed that close to it. I was like in the far periphery, up on Low Road.
We hand punch cards to the feeder.
I think that's right, and I think it went through many iterations and actually different. The one that I first used was not the first one they had, and I know the model numbers. And there's also an amazing history of computing at Dartmouth for if you want to like really get in the weeds online. It's like Dartmouth has produced online, of all places. Yeah, exactly. No, I'm sorry. It's in a Moroccan-bound leather volume. It's really beautifully done and lays out all these details decade by decade of each thing that happened. And it's like jaw-dropping. I mean, all the things that were happening here. Yeah. While I was protesting nukes on Main Street. Yes, Linda.
There are many people who stake a claim that Dartmouth was the birthplace of artificial intelligence. And there are others who would like to say it happened elsewhere.
Yeah.
For reasons you could imagine. Could you share with us, from all the research you've done, what your interpretation of those two camps?
Well, first of all, I don't know this dispute, and I actually, to my shame, although I just sat on a panel about AI, I don't entirely get what's meant by, philosophers continue to talk about artificial intelligence, and business people talk about machine learning, and assume that it already exists. And then, of course, there's the really far-out singularity stuff of like man and machine are fast becoming one, and machines that feel are right around the corner. So I don't really know what AI is, and I don't know the history of the dispute, so I should look into it. The one interesting thing to me is I just heard the philosopher John Searle, he was on this panel with me, lecture about artificial intelligence, and he has a very distinguished career. This was not a very distinguished talk. It's the same talk he gave in 1980, and unfortunately it's all over YouTube from 1980, and he does it exactly the same way he used to do it. Whatever, that's fine. But, for example, it's his Chinese room theory. Anyway, this is all boring, but he does say in some place, he's like, say this computer speaks a language that nobody speaks, like Chinese. Just like, wow, did that joke play in 1980? And then he draws fake Chinese symbols to be like, it's all gobbledygook or whatever, where there are like 4 Chinese people in the room. I don't know. He says, the Chinese room theory is about this box, anyway. So he talks about a box that can suddenly produce knowledge, and is that actually learning and knowing? But nobody in the room under 40 really thinks about computers as boxes that are self-contained. You can actually put a question into Yahoo Answers or Quora that demands a lot of thinking, and you get an answer out of it. Now, the answer, of course, is typed in by another person, though it could be a bot. And I'm not sure that the questions I ask my box and he asks his box, I'm happily believe mine are intelligence. You know, if it's artificial intelligence when you're asking a piece of hardware or something, whether it's networked or not, I mean, most young people have never seen a non-networked computer. So the idea of like, but this hunk of silicon can't think. Well, every hunk of silicon with a Wi-Fi connection can think just fine, at least for my purposes. So I don't understand the hair splitting around that, but I should get up to speed on the history of the debate.
It would be interesting to hear your perspective on
Yeah.
it, given your knowledge of the context.
Yeah. I mean, just the love of like what was East Coast computing, and it's like late breaking interest for me but I also, I mean, it's my mission to make the humanities relevant to the history of computing on the one hand, and then on the other to like, let's hear it for the East Coast, because currently the battle is cast as all these progressives and techno-utopians on the West Coast and all these Luddites here who don't want to lose their jobs in journalism, like, or in whatever, in establishment jobs. And, you know, I'd like to think that we have something to add, you know. Anybody else? Dad?
It's a quick note. I think the reason for the connection between Dartmouth and artificial intelligence is it was a conference, the first one on artificial intelligence held at Dartmouth.
Kamini era?
In or about, I think, maybe before Kennedy. I think it might have been 1950 because they recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the conference.
So maybe it was in the 60s.
Yeah. So I don't have exact dates, but it's something on the order of 1950.
Oh, interesting. I mean, the history of Dartmouth computing, like if there were a way to sort of slightly change it, would make its own good book, you know, not just for like our archives and egos, but like there really is a lot to say there, but it's hard to know exactly how to package it. But yes, I think I remember in the history of computing at Dartmouth, the first entry, or one of the first entries, isn't to do with Kemeny. Like I had to keep going.
Right.
Of course, I only wanted to know what happened after I was born. But when am I born? Bruce, anybody else? Yeah.
I understand a little bit more about what you mean by magic.
Yeah.
You talk about when you're talking about the law.
Right.
You talk a lot about gain.
Sorry?
You talk a lot
About gain.
about gain, but I
Yeah.
understand more what you meant about law.
I mean, the loss is almost exclusively what interests me at this moment. So I didn't touch on it because I would never stop talking. But I get the word from the engineering, sound engineers term of art, where MP3 compression. So the compression necessary to take a music signal and make it so easily distributable as it is in the iTunes store. You have to take a big signal that would be very expensive and require lots of broadband and crush it down. And that process is known as lossy compression because a huge amount is lost from that sound. Even though MP3 doesn't stand for something technical, it's just the name of the board of people with very good hearing who can judge, like food, Top Chef types, is this sound true to the original sound? And they can't hear the difference between even the original MP3 compression, couldn't originally, and live, vinyl, other ways of sending signals. But very quickly, people started to complain they could. And the idea even that something was lost, this sort of phantom thing that something was lost in that signal, or the conviction that something's lost in our relationships in email and text. One of the editor of Modern Love, the column in the New York Times, said the first entries he used to get were from people who had had nothing but a physical connection, like a one-night stand, and they had nothing to say to each other. Now, and for 10 years, he's gotten nothing but people saying, we have only an intellectual connection over text. All we do is text and trade photos and write poetry to each other, and we never touch. We've barely kissed. There's no sexual connection. And, that's a substantial loss to romance, people not getting in the same room together, just for instance. And then, I treat the same things in photography that, one of the things I discovered on early Flickr is that in the name of this high dynamic range kind of photography with like colors that pop and all these high contrasts and all these kind of pirouettes you do because you're dealing in high res and pixels, that when you put up what looks like these crazily cartoonish, garish, eye-hurting technical achievements, everybody praises them. But someone put up an Henri Cartier-Bresson photo that's like, you know, hailed as one of the greatest photographs of all time, and people were like, it's a little blurry, it's a little soft, I hate analog photography, right? So like, something seems lost there. We like don't have the capacity to appreciate black and white, chiaroscuro, like all these old aesthetics. I mean, I just reread a short story by Mary McCarthy, published in Harper's, a fairly pop publication, not anything especially arcane, and the sentences are at a level of complexity that you just can't even imagine publishing now. And I just read something that Obama's speech is a substantial order of magnitude less complex than Ronald Reagan's was. And Trump's is the least complex language we've ever heard in public space. It's like 3% of his sentences even reach the bar for complexity. So like if the Times is at a 7th grade reading level, he's like somewhere subliterate, like almost between kindergarten and 1st grade, like when people are incipiently learning to read. That's amazing. And that could be Trump, that could be the rise of populism, that could be something, but digital has something to do with it. I mean, the guy kills it on Twitter. And he sticks to monosyllables, he sticks to 140 characters, he knows his medium. And I don't know that Reagan was smarter than Obama, probably less smart, but that complexity is something I think that's been lost during digitization. Partly, and just to not to just get all sad about like life's getting coarser, is we live in a polyglot space when we live online. When I hear people complain about Twitter being illiterate or YouTube comments being misspelled, a person you're often talking to someone in their second, third language. And we're trying to put this thing together with emojis and hashtags and like make a new pidgin and all these new dialects that on the fly, like imagine a civilization of 4 billion people crashes together and trying to make this space together, make Facebook work, make whatever. And the language is the language is just changing so fast. I mean, I remember like 25 years ago, they were like, we've just discovered the first new language in forever. These deaf kids evolved a new form of sign language because they didn't have any access to ordinary sign language. And now, between emoji, bitmoji, emoticons, ASCII art, combinations of photography and memes, GIFs, they're just like these crazy new alphabets and new ways of talking that have evolved in such a short time. So those things have been rigged and put together very, very quickly. Humans in their infinite wisdom have been able to like evolve that so they can talk and trade and do all this stuff, fall in love online. But come on. I mean, when I start to get like, this Mary McCarthy story is very complicated, then like, that's sad. That's sad. Like, I've crowded out whatever part of my brain used to be able to handle nice long sentences in favor of learning Bitmojis, and damn, I know Bitmoji really well, but like I just didn't have the cognitive space. So I had to dump some of the German I know, and that's loss, and I think there's a feeling of grieving around the internet. I used to hear when I wrote about it for the New York Times, where I was told, be very cautious because people will need to you can't use shorthand for anything. If you refer to YouTube, every time it has to be like a clearinghouse for internet video owned by Google. There's no time you just say a YouTube video. So I was really cautious, and every time it had to be like analogies to the analog world, analogies to the physical world. Don't worry, I'm not like asking you to, partly so they'd read the column to the end. And then I got pushback from people saying, but in my heart, I was a Bolshevik in those days. I just wanted to be like, come on, get with it. Learn what YouTube is. Like, who cares if your magazine goes out of business? Like, it's all moving online anyway. And then I heard from readers, and partly because of the internet, they could write in on comments and start saying, like, slow down. Like, this is breaking my heart. And, I hate this in some ways. And, like, my wonderful skills in the real world for face-to-face interaction, for dinner table conversation, for time uninterrupted, time to just reflect, have been julienned and like wrecked by screens and by whatever. And at first I was impatient, and then I was compassionate, and then I completely identified, you know? I found things like analog phone calls with good copper wire where you could like just sit and really talk. I missed those. I missed my warm leather Filofax compared to Google Calendars. And then I started to miss a ton more stuff. And then I started to miss reasoned dialogue, and I was like, why do I hang out on Twitter and let myself just get beat up all the time calling this progress? Like, I wish I could sit down with someone and just talk about the ideas rationally. By the way, because the Trumpites are so good at just like kindergarten stuff of being where you, like we say, there's voter fraud here, and then they say, you've got voter fraud. So I remembered recently that one time I was so down on my health and I went to the ear doctor, and the ear doctor looked in my ear and he said, you know what, I think you've got a little eczema in here. And I was so mad that I just went, you've got eczema. Mature, right? And by the way, in adulthood. And so now I've tried this comeback on Twitter when they're like, you know, when someone's just like, you're a racist cunt or whatever to me, I say, you've got eczema. I think you've got eczema might be like my bio on Twitter. And it's very powerful. It silenced them way more than anything else. So I offer it to you. Just when you're, you've got eczema. Just a great comeback. It never fails. Yeah.
I have a friend who, somewhat mischievously, we were talking about reading poetry, and he said, oh, I can't anymore, it moves too slow.
Oh.
He was talking about the impatience with that way of experiencing something. And he was also prodding me somewhat. But what do you think about countervailing experience that somebody in experiencing missing
Yeah.
could make another choice? Like I've noticed no-fi cafes where there isn't any life.
I am so glad you brought this up because, you know, the culture and its infinite wisdom has pushed back, is pushing back, and has done some completely things you would never predict. So in 1950s, IBM, they said the best thing about computers would we'd all be able to work remotely and not come in together. Now so many offices say you have to come in. Some of this is a security concern. At Goldman Sachs, they didn't want to put anything on email, so all of a sudden, let's discuss live, everything happens live. The Navy, for fear that GPS technology will be hacked, has started training sailors on sextants, compasses, and celestial navigation. People who just felt hurt or felt like they couldn't read poetry because it was too slow, or they wanted something slower. I mean, all the really bleeding edge techies I know will do these crazy things like go to a dojo and don't talk to anyone for 6 months, and then decide, like this one guy, Craig Mod you met, is like carving into a piece of silver, something like, you know, 100, I don't know, some enormous number of bytes of data into like 1 inch. It's like, it's in these insane projects. And then maker culture in San Francisco, London, Williamsburg, people like right around me, where I'm telling you like Twitter, like it's the latest thing, someone 3 blocks over is butchering his own meat into it in Brooklyn. Like we wouldn't have predicted it. The number of people I know who are just like, you know what's next? Quilting. You know, tatting, like just stuff that like you barely heard of. Vinyl sales are through the roof. They're more than in the heyday of Gimme Shelter. They're more than in the heyday of any band. The Rolling Stones make more touring. The only way any musician makes money is touring and live music. The Rolling Stones, who are however old, make $1 billion a year touring. They never could touch $1 billion a year when they were like the hottest thing. They don't care about recorded music because it's free. So, you know, so part of it is like, you can't make any money online, and you can't be secure online, and people are bored with living online. I mean, one of the greatest things, and maybe if people are running out of steam, we can end with this. One of the greatest things that I keep citing is that a bunch of kids in Silicon Valley decided that they were too addicted to their phones. My own son, my 11-year-old son, has decided phones are a leash, they're feminizing, they connect him too much to apron strings. That's the goal, right? But he doesn't want a phone because he doesn't make him resourceful. He wants to be someone that can find his way around without GPS. So there's pushback. But anyway, these kids in Silicon Valley felt like they were just fools. They were looking at this banal Apple interface, you know, all the time. And like, where was their life going except into like however many square inches of space with these blocky apps. It's so dull. So they said, I have one chance on earth. So they started to, this part, don't try at home, but put a little bit of acid, like a microdose of LSD, under their skin. And they discovered they had no interest in their phones because the faces of people on the bus became so fascinating. I mean, it doesn't take acid. And one of my favorite things, I've told Mom this, just my favorite thing now is hearing millennials say, like, yeah, I don't really want to talk about Snapchat. I was looking at a tree the other day. And you just are like, really? And tell me, it was interesting, right? You know? So, and in so many other fields of endeavor, there have been pushback for those three reasons. The aesthetic, the feeling of loss that makes you miss the warmth of the vinyl sound, or the affection of actually being in the room with someone you're romantically interested in, or just the skin and variety that's not like that antiseptic aesthetic of Apple products, and the fears of security that make the Navy do it, and Goldman Sachs do it. And then, I don't remember what I said the last one was. Maybe that feminizing thing that, you know, or emasculating thing that my son described, that like, I don't want to be one of those people that's like on Twitter all day. It's trivializing my big brain. So I'm going to do Outward Bound for 7 months or whatever. It's so many young people. It's the young people that are going to flip phones, that are jumping off social media. It's definitely the next thing.
And making artisanal cheese.
Making artisanal cheese. Oh my gosh, I had a babysitter recently who was like, I just met the greatest guy. He's a cheesemonger who does robotics. Okay, that's your Elvis Presley. Got it. There was someone else. Bruce.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.